Yo, hello. We are back once again with another Grail tier list update, this time for the beginning of November. It was initially going to come out sometime around the middle or late of October, but I decided that rather than doing that, now I'm slightly adjusting that, so it's going to be for the beginning of the month. Today we got the same thing going on once again. I'll be going over my overall thoughts on the newer changes that we got to the game, new inheritance, new PRFs, new units, as well as a final tally at the end of the video. That will consist of a list of Grails that, in my opinion, are definitely worth building up at this moment, so we may as well get right into it. For anyone who isn't in the know for how these types of videos work, I got 3 tier lists going on, one for Aether Raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena, and the units that perform the best overall on a cumulative total will end up being one of the units I end up ranking in the end. That being said, some units will definitely take a lot more investment nowadays than older ones, so when you're looking to consider one unit over the other, just know that max investment is being considered. And if you have any feedback or questions, leave it in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. The one other thing that I did change for this format is that rather than going and putting an arcane symbol next to a specific unit, I now have a different symbol that which you can see at the bottom left corner, which will indicate whether or not the unit in question is using the PRF they come with, because I realized that some units aren't really being ranked with arcanes in mind, but they're using different inheritables instead. Kicking us off for the Aether Raids tier list, we have Heath with his new Hyperion Lance, Halloween Kellum, and Marla. For the most part, I would say all 3 of these units are more or less just side grids to what we already have in the game. Halloween Kellum and Marla don't really do anything in particular that makes them stand out, although Kellum does have really high BST for arena purposes, but as far as unit performance goes, they're more or less just going to be the same as every other generic that we have, just with a more updated BST. Meanwhile, with Heath, I would definitely say he did get a good refine, but definitely competes with a lot of the other Lance flyers that we have in the Grail shop at this time, and in my opinion, he didn't necessarily get something that allowed him to stand out comparatively. That being said, as far as Lance flyers are concerned, he's definitely doing better than a lot of the other ones. His Hyperion Lance has Cav effectiveness that grants Spectrum 8. He debuffs the foe based on 10% of his defense at the start of combat, aka whatever is visible prior to entering it. Guard, a guaranteed follow-up, and a weird pseudo guard bearing where he does get damage reduction on the first combat, and it gets subsequently weaker as more combats are entered through the specific phase. And it is a very enemy phase oriented weapon, so chances are you're not really going to be using it in something like the player phase. Even so, I wouldn't say his weapon's bad by any means. I would just say there isn't anything there in particular that allows him to stand out comparatively. You can still use the same old stuff of guard bearing, gambit, guidance for it, anything of the sort, just to make him a really annoying stat ball and frontliner. And overall, I would say as far as the free units are concerned for this month, they were definitely on the lower end of impressiveness, but they aren't bad by any means. What I am impressed with, however, is Veil, who is a very, very good Astra Mythic. Her biggest contribution to Astra Season is that she grants Scout to any ally based on her own res at the start of combat, which is an incredibly useful tool for defensive plays, especially since Freyr does exist now and negates all sorts of shenanigans that Elamine would have had. Prior to Veil's addition, at the very least, Elamine was able to provide damage reduction support through Holy Ground, but now with Veil in Fel Protection, she can not only provide Scout, but also first hit damage reduction, making what Elamine does for the most part, in my opinion, very, very minuscule. Although she can heal allies and does have other supportive skills that she can take advantage of, in my opinion, with Veil now in the game, there's very, very little reason to use Elamine, especially now that Freyr is a thing, and as Ketria balls are going to continue returning to Anima Season, having some Scout support in tow is going to be very useful. And as far as inheritable is concerned, there were a lot of newer additions, but also a lot of side grades. I would definitely say the most notable options that we did get were the bonus doubler weapons that we did get on the Halloween banner, aerial maneuvers from Legendary Alencia, and attack res tempo 4. Attack res tempo 4 I'll go into in a bit, but as far as aerial maneuvers and bonus doubler 4 is concerned, the former has a less strict dive bomb condition and allows the user to warp whenever necessary. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the craziest skill, but in terms of users in the Grail shop, I think one of the most notable candidates is definitely Summer Male Shez, because he has a speedy brave weapon, and that with Snap means that he could go in with very high movement options, hit 4 times if he's able to quad, and return back whenever necessary with the cancel built into his weapon. Very useful stuff for him specifically. Meanwhile, with the bonus doubler weapons in A slot that we did get in bonus doubler 4, the big benefit outside of getting extra stats is pseudo lull and panic immunity, as long long as your allies aren't affected, you can still steal their visible buffs within 2 spaces and still get the full amount of spectrum stats that you would otherwise get from bonus doubler. It's also in the form of an inheritable red tome and sword, and really the big thing is going to be coming from Callum's weapon specifically, because you could run a melee specialist with Aether and Gold Serpent who can visibly buff up to 8 attack and speed, making the amount of stats you would be getting in general so much higher comparatively. And while I would definitely consider the red tome in some aspects, you're not really going to be using it on an offense setting in my opinion, because most units aren't really going to be taking advantage of those stats comparatively as if on a Aether Raids defense setting. And while you could always consider Aether Raids defense, I think the big issue there is definitely going to come from panic. You could always run some panic protection from an ally, but that's not something that you're going to readily get off, especially for something like Dark Season where you still have a full turn to get that going. And meanwhile with Anima Season, while you do have the ability to run Freyr, he doesn't return the blue buffs, he just removes the penalties, so you won't be getting any stats that way. That being said, I don't want to completely throw it out the window. I think there is potential there, but overall I would definitely say the sword is a lot more splashable comparatively. And before we get to the tier list itself, there's the new attuned heroes that we did get, and lane I really want to talk about with Dazzle Fartrace. I think there easily could be potential with this skill, but at the moment I don't think there really is much going for it, because Staves don't have access to any sort of setup skills that they could otherwise take advantage of. That being said, if they do end up dropping some in the future, you'll definitely see more of an overview of it. And lastly, with the attuned heroes, it's basically extra skill slots that any unit can take advantage of as long as they meet the prerequisite skill restriction. Attack Oath Echo, which just grants visible attack and warping, and Death Blow Echo, which grants 4 attack in the player phase. Relatively decent stuff overall. Not so much stuff that in my opinion would change for the Aether Raids tier list, but the former in particular will definitely be useful for Summoner Duels. That being said, as far as Aether Raids is concerned, I don't think there's really going to be many changes when it comes to the higher tiers. I think the most notable ones are definitely going to be coming from somebody like Halloween Enna, Limstella, and Teotihu. Mostly the Green Tome, since they have access to the new Arcane Caliburnus. Enna does have the benefit of being a side grade Garen now, because she does have access to Veil's Scowl support, which was something that was separating both of them comparatively. As far as stats are concerned, they're more or less going to be on a similar playing field, but Garen's big benefit was that he did have access to Guard and Scowl, and with the distant counter seal, he was able to act relatively well on his own. But now that we do have Scowl support from Veil, I can definitely see Enna taking advantage of it as well. Meanwhile, with Limstella and Teotihu, the big thing is definitely going to be coming from Arcane Caliburnus, but also attack res tempo from Veil. The weapon has low attack res as well as a guaranteed follow-up, breath, slaying. So in situations where you have to go up against Scowl and Guard, you can definitely bypass it with the likes of the breath effect in there as well as tempo. Tempo is really there for the extra firepower, and it does help the slower units that can't really take advantage of the no follow-up effect. But Tempo 4 does have shred just like magical no follow, so it's still a worthwhile consideration for any of your mages. That being said, with the breath effect in tow and low attack res, their damage output is going to be very significant, which is why I did end up promoting them to the solid tier. Otherwise, there is another promotion in the form of Winter Bruno, and this is on a similar level due to Arcane Caliburnus, but also being able to take advantage of Veil's Scowl support, which is something that I think a lot of armors definitely needed. But otherwise, there was the Chronia demotion, and the big thing with Chronia in my opinion is that it's becoming increasingly more difficult to one-tap a lot of stuff. I think it is a lot more flexible in something like Summoner Duels, but at the same time, but when it comes to something like Aether Raids offense, I think there are too many threats that could shrug off a lethality from her, and it isn't to say that she's bad by any means, but in my opinion, it is becoming increasingly more difficult, especially now that we do have Freyr, who is a very notable tank at this time. Other than that, it's just a mass amount of demotions, partially due to Veil's Scowl support making it so you can tank specials whenever necessary, and a lot of the other flyers and cabs that also suffer because of it. I think one of the only units that definitely benefit at this time is Leo because of Arcane Caliburnus in the breath. It's very easy to set up all sorts of miracle shenanigans. If you want to run Flared Sparrow for extra terrain gimmicks, you can definitely do that. I wouldn't say he's the craziest unit by any means, but with the breath effect in tow, it's very easy to get him going in the player phase, and if you really need him to survive something, there's a good chance that he could get that going very easily. But other than that, I think a lot of these units are going to be struggling a lot more because of Veil's Scowl support in tow, especially the Arcane Eclipse units that are able to charge their own specials on their own. Elamine may not be able to shut them down, but Veil is definitely going to be a very prevalent unit going forward. And other than that, this is really going to be it when it comes to the Aether Raids changes. I wouldn't say it was a lot comparatively to other months, but there's still plenty of things worth talking about in my opinion. Next, we have the Summoner Duels update, and this is more or less just going to be akin to how it was in the Aether Raids tier list. Two of the units are pretty much just side grades of pre-existing units with modern BST, so they're going to be going in their own respective places. Meanwhile, with Heath, well, I wouldn't say he's one of the best lance flying grails that we have in the game. His role as a a frontline support with guidance and guard bearing has significantly increased because of his ability to warp around. And this isn't a Heath exclusive thing, but it's becoming more and more apparent that melee flyers are some of the best archetypes you could have for any sort of Summoner Duels experience because of how much frontline protection and support they can offer. And I wouldn't even say his combat is bad by any means. You will have to watch out for specific units that could easily run in and kill him, mainly Summer Ephraim, but with guard bearing in his weapon and guard bearing 4 in tow, all he really has to do is sit there and provide support to his allies and just be a really obnoxious wall to prevent a lot of foes from walking in. TLDR, melee flyers are very, very good at the moment. Outside of the guidance 4 and attack Oath Echo stuff, you definitely have to watch out now for Veil and Legendary Alencia, both of which have very fantastic utility. Veil is a very good combat unit who also provides Strive Scowl, which is going to be very, very good moving forward, especially for units that aren't able to survive a lot of the modern nukes that we have nowadays, which has been becoming increasingly difficult due to how lopsided the balance is between tank and nukes. Meanwhile, with Legendary Alencia, outside of a really decent combat with her dual phase Brave Slaying weapon, she does have Heart of Crimea, which is a super guidance C slot, which not only provides warp to herself, but anybody within 2 spaces can warp to her, including cavalry, and she grants visible no follow-up to every single ally within 2 spaces at the start of the turn. Suffice to say, she is a very beneficial unit, and with how prevalent visible bonuses are becoming, you'll definitely see her more often than not. But outside of that, a lot of the promotions are mainly just coming from melee flyers for very obvious reasons. Even the weakest ones have so much defensive capabilities that it's really hard not to use them in modern day Summoner Duels. Halloween Enna, again, is going to be another similar case to Garen, where she's more or less just going to be a side grid, especially now that she has access to Veil. You could double stack Scowl if you really want to, although in my opinion, you're definitely better off running Bracing Stance or any sort of skill that provides guard to her. Hell, you could also run guard support if you really wanted to, but you have to be careful with the amount of support you're bringing versus firepower, because otherwise she's not really going to be doing much. But even so, she's more or less just going to be a side grade Garen at this point because of Veil, and because of that, I did end up promoting her to the solid tier alongside all the other melee flyers at this point. And hopefully I didn't miss one on this list. Even so, outside of the melee flyers and Enna, you have units like Female Robin and Limstella who also benefit from Arcane Caliburnus. They have access to very good skills at this point, especially given their infantry status, and Limstella in particular is able to hit really, really hard on top of having relatively decent bulk. That with attack risk tempo and a lot of the other skills that they have access to, you can definitely make a case for using them at this point. The only units you may not be able to make a use case for right now are the infantry melees, and that's just because they don't particularly do anything for Summoner Duels. You could definitely bring them and have them do some stuff, but in my opinion, unless they have some very grandiose PRF that allows them to stand out, maybe such as a Lear, their use case is definitely going to be a lot more debatable. You could use them in tandem with Brave Soren, but in my opinion, they're not also necessarily the best near saves that we have currently. Especially when it comes to Gambit Miracle spam, you definitely have a lot of better options available to you. And because of that, I ended up demoting them as well. It's not that they're necessarily bad units, but with how Summoner Duels is, I find that they just don't necessarily fit in comparatively. But you can definitely make use of them if you really want to try. Other than that, it's another Valentine's Leo promotion. Again, I wouldn't say he's the craziest unit, but with Miracle, Arcane Caliburnus' acceleration, Flared Sparrow, Escape Route, and Defense Rest Smoke, you can definitely try some setup gimmicks. I wouldn't necessarily say he doesn't hit hard, although compared to other units, he definitely lacks. He is able to set up Flared Sparrow and Miracle really, really fast, so I would say there are some benefits to it. But at the same time, you do have to keep your expectations in tow. And same with a lot of the melee cabs. I think the big thing, again, is that they don't necessarily fulfill as much of a purpose, although you could definitely make the same build case for them. I find that they don't really do much beyond that. Whereas at least the infantry could maybe run some stuff like cancel control or provide some near save support. There really isn't much that they're particularly going to be able to do outside of maybe some Flared Sparrow gimmicks, and even then that's always just going to be a one-trick pony. You can definitely still make use of it, but at this time I wouldn't say generic cabs are in the best spot right now. That being said, I wouldn't say any of these units are bad by any means. I just think Summoner Duels in particular is very, very strict into what you can and can't do. But if you did want to try and use them, you can absolutely do that. And that's really going to be about it when it comes to the Summoner Duels updates. Otherwise, we have Arena, and at this point, given how much Arena scoring bloat there is, I'm just going to be showing you all the units that score score 758 and above at this point, because you're not really going to be scoring the best otherwise. You have a lot of units that do fall into the 756 bin and below. It's just a big old mesh of units that you probably aren't going to be building anyway because of how much investment you need to get them going. And if you are looking to take scoring very seriously, then I would recommend some of these units in the higher tiers. Cyril is still one of the best scoring units that we have in the Grail shop. Kellum also follows that, although he's just one of the 3 generic armors that we do have. He still does have the armor benefits, which is still great to have around, especially if you are in need of protection. But otherwise, you have a lot of other units in the 760 area and 758 area who can still provide their own relative niches as well. Meanwhile, with Heath and Marla, they end up scoring 756 respectively. Marla doesn't have a PRF, but she does reach 185 BST naturally, so she is able to fall into that score range. Meanwhile, given how old Heath is, he will need a dual skill to properly score. And by properly score, I mean barely score the bare minimum, which I still wouldn't necessarily recommend, but if you did want to use him, he could still score 756 because of his new PRF. And for the last bit in the video, I do want to quickly talk about Legendary Alencia, who is another addition to Win Season. She has mega mobility with super guidance in her C slot, so you could have a lot of units teleport around. And I think the big thing for something like Win Season moving forward is that you probably are going to want some sort of ability to negate that, because her ability to allow any unit to warp in within 2 spaces can be very, very deadly at times, or even herself, who can warp to any ally within 2 spaces. It can become increasingly annoying and obnoxious, especially if you have no way to stop it through Canto control, which is something you may not even be able to run if you are trying to score optimally, because it only scores 240 SP. That being said, because she does share a season with Legendary Mar, I would highly recommend trying and going for her if you can, just because of how useful the anti-warp is going to be in that mode. But otherwise, if you are trying to stop it, you could always go for somebody like Legendary Hinoka, who can pretty much hit and run with her very, very high mobility in Assault Troop. You also have Legendary Robin if you just want to use him as a bonus in base kit. He has Canto control innately, so you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much. But generally speaking, she's going to be a very prominent unit in the Win Season just because of modern BST scoring on top of how much utility she does have. And if you are looking to use Halloween Kellum, Heath, or Marla in any of these respective seasons, I would recommend the Fire Season, Water Season, and Wind Season. This is because, in my opinion, they have relatively good coverage there compared to any other season. Kellum, while he does suffer from armor effective weaponry, that's not necessarily anything new, as every season has a very, very prominent armor killer. I find that he best suits fire mainly because of the amount of melee threats that there are there. Meanwhile, with Water Season, there are a lot of melee threats there as well, although it's more predominantly blue. I think your Lance Flyers are definitely going to have the best time there, mainly because they don't necessarily have to counter stuff like Legendary Leaf or Crom or Byleth, who would definitely destroy them. And even in a scenario where you do have to go up against somebody like Ninian, they can easily shrug it off because she doesn't have any piercing, and Guard Bearing plus Gambit has a very, very high amount of damage reduction ceiling, so there's a good chance you could just shrug it off. And other than that, you have Wind Season, which is very predominantly high with debuffs, mobility, and Canto, so being able to take advantage of such things can definitely be beneficial for a lot of your red tomes. And that's really going to be about it when it comes to the arena list. Lastly, I do want to quickly talk about the units I would highly recommend building at this time, although this list can easily change in a span of a banner or a month, but in my opinion, these 9 units are probably some of the best investments you could go for at this time. It's more or less just going to be the same units as it was last time, although now with the added addition of Kellum instead of a guard. That's mainly because, in my opinion, he has access to a lot of better weaponry. Even though, in my opinion, they're more or less just the same unit, just a different weapon type, you might have a better time using Kellum just because of his weapon accessibility. But even if scoring doesn't incentivize you, you also have stuff like Arian, a lot of the other Lance Flyers, the Dancers with mixed utility, and so on and so forth. And I would say at this time, a lot of the Grails are in a relatively decent position for building up. These just happen to be some of the best ones, in my opinion, if you're looking to use them in a lot of other areas. But that's just me. If you have any other questions or concerns, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.